On February 4, 2026, 3 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona, a 42-year-old man sitting alone in his apartment in Hawthorne, California, picked up his phone. He did not open a news app. He did not open social media. He opened an application specifically designed to generate fake, untraceable phone numbers. And then he typed out a message, and he sent it directly to Annie Guthrie Sion, Nancy's daughter, the woman who had last seen her mother walk through a front door 3 days earlier and had not seen her since. The message read, "Did you get the Bitcoin? We are waiting on our end for the transaction." Then he sat back and waited to see if a grieving family would respond. The FBI had him in handcuffs within 72 hours. His name is Derek Kella. He is 42 years old. And when agents read him his Miranda rights and asked whether he had sent those texts, he said yes, just like that. No hesitation. No attorney present. His own words, recorded by federal agents, handed directly to prosecutors. He pleaded not guilty in court. And then, for 5 months, while investigators processed DNA, analyzed surveillance footage, searched across the border into Mexico, and processed more than 50,000 tips, Derek Kella said nothing. Until now. If you are new here, this channel covers cases exactly like this one, where the facts on the surface do not tell the full story, and where the details buried inside court documents reveal something far more disturbing than the headlines ever did. This is DAV Crime Records. Hit that subscribe button now so you do not miss a single update as this case continues to develop. Because this week, Derek Kella walked back into federal court and changed his plea. And in that same 72-hour window, CBS News published something that investigators had been deliberately holding back for 4 months. A confirmation, on the record, sourced to people familiar with the investigation, that the 2 ransom notes sent to the Guthrie family in February almost certainly came from the actual person or persons who abducted Nancy. Not a hoaxer, not an opportunist, the abductors themselves. 2 major developments, 1 week, and tonight we are going into all of it. Let us start at the very beginning, because the beginning is more disturbing than anything the headlines told you. Nancy Guthrie disappeared on or around February 1, 2026, in Tucson, Arizona. The last person known to have seen her was Toamaso Sion, her son-in-law, the husband of her daughter Annie, who drove Nancy home that evening. She walked through the front door of her home, and she was gone. No signs of a struggle made public, no voluntary departure. From the earliest stages of the investigation, law enforcement treated her disappearance as an abduction. Annie Guthrie Sion, Nancy's daughter, became the center of a family's desperate search for answers. She was the one calling for help publicly. She was the one asking for information. She was the one who would later become the target of Derek Kella's messages. And Toamaso, the man who had driven Nancy home that final night, received the second message Kella sent. Think about what it means to be those 2 people in those days. The last person to see her and the daughter waiting by the phone, and to receive a text from an unknown number claiming to be the kidnappers. Approximately 1 day after Nancy was taken, on February 2, 2026, a ransom note arrived. It was sent to TMZ and to local Tucson television stations. The note demanded $4 million in Bitcoin. It described Nancy as safe, but scared, and it contained 2 specific details that law enforcement was able to verify: what Nancy was wearing on the night she disappeared, and where her Apple Watch was located inside her bedroom. Those 2 details had not been released publicly at the time the note was received. The only people who could have known them were people who had direct, first-hand knowledge of what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night she was taken. That is what made the note significant. That is what made it real. Law enforcement did not release the contents of the note in full. They held specific details back deliberately, including the exact Bitcoin wallet address the note provided for the ransom payment. That information stayed out of the media. Investigators understood that controlling what was known publicly and what was not would be critical to separating genuine leads from interference. 2 days later, on February 4th, Derek Kella interfered. Kella had been following coverage of Nancy's disappearance. He had read about the Bitcoin ransom demand. That detail had surfaced in some media reports within hours of the original note becoming known. He used that publicly available information, combined with personal phone numbers he researched through social media, public records, and aggregated data sources available to anyone with enough patience and an internet connection, to construct his own version of a ransom demand. He set up the anonymous phone number application. He crafted the messages carefully, and then he sent them to Annie and to Toamaso. This was not impulsive. The federal criminal complaint is clear on that point. Kella had to locate the family's personal contact information. He had to download and configure the application. He had to write messages designed specifically to look like they had come from the real kidnappers. That process takes time and deliberate thought. This was a sequence of calculated decisions made by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. When FBI agents arrived at his apartment in Hawthorne on February 5, 2026, and read him his Miranda rights, Kella admitted without an attorney present that he had sent the texts. He told agents his reason was that he wanted to see how the family would react. That explanation, recorded and documented by federal investigators, became part of the criminal complaint filed against him. He was charged with 2 federal offenses. The first, transmitting a demand for ransom in interstate commerce without disclosing his identity. The second, using a telecommunications device with intent to abuse, threaten, or harass. Both charges carried the weight of federal prosecution, and both were supported by Kella's own recorded admission, independent technical evidence from the anonymous application, and cell tower data reviewed by investigators. But there is one detail in the federal criminal complaint that almost no coverage of this case mentioned, and it is the most humanly disturbing element of everything Derek Kella did. Beyond the 2 text messages, he made a phone call. A 9-second phone call to Annie Sion's personal number, placed from the same fake application. 9 seconds, not enough time for a real conversation. Barely enough time for a sentence. The call is included in the federal complaint as part of the charged conduct. What was said during those 9 seconds, or whether anything was said at all, has not been publicly confirmed. But consider what that call actually meant in human terms. Annie Guthrie Sion was in the middle of one of the most terrifying experiences a daughter can endure. Her mother was missing. Days had passed with no confirmed word on where she was or whether she was alive, and Annie looked down at her phone and saw an unknown number calling. She answered it, or she saw it ring, in a moment when every unknown number could be the call that told her everything. Texts are something a person can send without fully processing the human impact on the other end. A phone call is different. You have to dial the number. You have to choose to let it ring. For a family in that position, that distinction is not a small one. U.S. Attorney Timothy Chain addressed it directly in the press release announcing the arrest, stating that the Department of Justice would protect victims and families and that grief profiteers would be held accountable. FBI Phoenix Special Agent in Charge, Hath Janae, added that anyone attempting to take advantage of the situation would be investigated and face consequences for their actions. Kella appeared in Tucson federal court in February 2026. He pleaded not guilty. And then, for 5 months, as the broader investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continued, DNA processing, surveillance analysis, cross-border searches, tens of thousands of tips, Derek Kella's case sat quietly in the federal system. His trial was scheduled for June 23, 2026. That trial did not happen. A motion to continue was granted. A change of plea hearing was scheduled for July 2nd. In the federal court system, a defendant changing their plea from not guilty to guilty almost always happens for one of two reasons. The first is straightforward. An attorney reviews the evidence, sees the recorded Miranda admission, the technical app records, the cell tower data, and the documented phone call, and tells their client that fighting the charges at trial will not succeed. The math of the evidence against Kella on the charged conduct was not difficult. He admitted it on the day of his arrest. The FBI had independent technical confirmation to support every element of the charges. His attorneys would have advised him that accepting responsibility and seeking leniency from the court was the more rational path forward. In that scenario, this is a case about one man who made a series of deliberate and cruel decisions and is now accepting the legal consequence of those decisions. The second scenario involves something the federal system refers to as a cooperation agreement, specifically what is known under federal sentencing guidelines as a 5K 1.1 motion, in which a defendant agrees to provide substantial assistance to the government in the investigation or prosecution of another person. Under that arrangement, prosecutors can recommend a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for information. For that scenario to apply to Kella, he would need to possess information that federal investigators consider valuable enough to justify the offer of a deal. The official position on Kella has always been that he was an opportunist with no known connection to the Guthrie family, no prior criminal history suggesting involvement in violent crime, and no link to the Tucson area. If that assessment is entirely complete, he has nothing to trade. He would simply plead guilty and receive whatever sentence the court determines is appropriate. But experienced investigators will note something worth understanding. The FBI does not always disclose publicly when a person under investigation had access to information relevant to a larger case. The public-facing characterization of a suspect and the internal investigative strategy being pursued are not always identical. If Kella, through his monitoring of online coverage of this case, through forums, message boards, or communities where high-profile cases are discussed, encountered any information that connected in any meaningful way to the real operation behind Nancy Guthrie's abduction, that information could carry value. Not because Kella was involved in the crime itself, but because information moves through channels that investigators do not always have direct visibility into, and someone who was watching those channels closely in the days after February 1st might have seen something worth knowing about. And then, in the same week that Kella's plea change was filed, CBS News published what investigators had kept off the record for 4 months. A confirmation, sourced to people familiar with the case, that the 2 ransom notes sent to the Guthrie family in February 2026 almost certainly originated from the actual individuals who abducted Nancy. Not from someone like Kella who read about it in the news. From the people who were there. From the people who knew what she was wearing and where her Apple Watch was sitting in her bedroom. 2 things happening in the same week. A man who inserted himself into a kidnapping investigation, changing his federal plea. And the confirmation, finally made public, that the real notes were real all along. Whether those 2 developments are connected in any direct way is something the evidence does not currently support stating. But experienced investigators do not walk past that kind of timing without asking questions. And those questions are exactly where this case is headed next. On February 2nd, 2026, approximately 1 day after Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in Tucson, Arizona, a ransom note arrived at TMZ and at local Tucson television stations. It demanded $4 million in Bitcoin. It described Nancy as safe but scared, and it contained 2 specific details that could not have come from news coverage, could not have been guessed, and could not have been constructed from anything available to the public. It described what Nancy was wearing the night she disappeared, and it identified the location of her Apple Watch, white band, on the bedroom floor. Those details were verified, and for 4 months, investigators said nothing publicly about whether they believed that note was real. On June 22, 2026, CBS News published a report sourced to investigators familiar with the case that changed the entire foundation of what the public understood about this investigation. For the first time, with that level of official sourcing, it was confirmed. Investigators believe the 2 ransom notes sent to the Guthrie family in February likely came from the actual person or persons who abducted Nancy Guthrie. Not from someone like Derek Kella, who read about the case online. Not from a hoaxer looking for attention. From the individuals who were there. CBS News also confirmed that investigators believe both notes were sent using the same secure server infrastructure. The same anonymizing technical approach, which points to a single sender or a single coordinated group responsible for both communications. 13 News in Tucson, which received the notes directly and immediately shared the originating IP address data with law enforcement, confirmed this independently. Brian Enton reported on News Nation this same week, stating clearly that those are the notes the FBI believes are real and that Savannah Guthrie believes are real. Savannah herself said it directly in an NBC interview in March, telling viewers that she tends to believe the 2 notes the family received and responded to are genuine. 4 months. That is how long investigators held that assessment internally before allowing it to reach the public record. And the question worth sitting with is why they chose this specific week to let it out. When law enforcement withholds an assessment like this, the reason is always the same. The notes are evidence. The IP address routing data, even passing through a secure server, carries forensic information. The language inside those notes is being actively analyzed by behavioral scientists and linguistic experts. And everything confirmed publicly is potentially seen and heard by the person who wrote them. Investigators do not confirm details like this casually or without purpose. When that confirmation comes after 4 months of deliberate silence, it means something has shifted inside the investigation. As investigative journalist Howard Bloom reported, the task force had returned to the ransom notes by default because other investigative leads had run dry. The decision to let the public know that those notes are likely authentic was a calculated one. It changes the public's role. It tells anyone who has any information, anyone who heard a conversation, anyone who knows something about who sent those notes or where they were sent from, that what they know is now more important than it has ever been. So let us examine what those confirmed notes actually tell us forensically, because the specific language confirmed by CBS News and by reporter Brianna Whitney, who reported on actually seeing the second note, gives us the clearest profile of the author this investigation has ever produced publicly. The first note opened with these words, "Hello, Savannah. We have your mother, Nancy." That is a personal address. First name, direct, deliberate. The author was not writing generically to a family or to law enforcement. They were writing specifically to Savannah Guthrie by name. That choice is not accidental. It tells you that the author knew exactly who they were addressing and made a conscious decision to speak to her personally. That is not how someone with no connection to the situation writes. That is how someone writes when they are fully aware of the specific people involved and want those people to understand that awareness. The second note is where the forensic picture becomes significantly more complex. It read, "We never intended to hurt her in all of this. She perished shortly after she was taken. She was buried with nature. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome, and we are truly sorry." Retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffin-Dafer, quoted in Newsweek, called this language extremely unusual. She described it as poetic rather than harsh. She noted the presence of what reads as genuine empathy in the phrasing. She pointed out that there is no operational reason for an abductor to provide this level of detail or this kind of emotional explanation. Forensic analyst McGregor, also quoted in Newsweek, argued that the behavioral pattern across both notes is more consistent with an inexperienced local actor than with any kind of professional criminal operation. Professional operations minimize public exposure. They avoid unnecessary communication after a crime is committed. They do not explain themselves. They do not apologize. The person who wrote these notes did all three. And then there is the word perished. Not died, not passed away, perished. That specific word choice is something linguistic analysts focus on because it sits outside the range of how a native English speaker would naturally phrase a statement about someone's death in that context. It raises two possibilities that investigators are actively considering. The first is that the author is not a native English speaker and may have used a translation application to compose the message, which would itself be a traceable forensic detail. The second is the artificial intelligence possibility, that the text was generated or significantly shaped by an AI writing tool, which carries its own set of identifiable linguistic patterns that trained analysts can detect and document. Brian Enton raised what may be the most consequential unanswered question in this entire case when he appeared on News Nation this week. He asked whether the remorse in that second note is genuine, whether the words, "We are truly sorry," reflect actual emotional weight carried by the person who wrote them, or whether the language is strategic, a legal foundation being constructed in advance of an arrest the author feared was approaching. That question is not rhetorical. The answer to it may define who this person actually is, what drove them to do what they did, and how this case ultimately reaches its resolution. Now there is something that has been circulating within the investigative community that deserves direct and careful public examination. Retired homicide detective Chris McDonough, director of the Cold Case Foundation, spent 7 days in Tucson personally investigating this case. He brings 25 years in law enforcement, 13 of those in a homicide unit, and a personal case solvability rate of approximately 90%. What he identified during his time on the ground is something that national coverage has not adequately addressed. Annie Guthrie Sion's jewelry workshop is located in an area that McDonough characterized as high crime, with significant fentanyl activity, an environment where, in his own words, you would find that guy on the porch. Annie also supports a foundation operating in that same area, one that assists formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrating into society, helping with employment applications and related support. McDonough's contact point theory, which he has been clear to frame as a theory he wanted to explore rather than a conclusion he has reached, asks a specific and focused question. Is it possible that someone in that environment overheard a conversation about Annie's family, learned through that proximity that her sister was a nationally recognized television journalist connected to significant wealth, and identified Nancy Guthrie as a potential target from within a community Annie was charitably engaged with? He also noted something geographic that carries real investigative weight. There are 3 Walmart stores within 2 miles of Annie's workshop. The Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack carried by the suspect, visible on doorbell camera footage, has been confirmed as a Walmart product. The clothing, the mask, and the equipment seen on that footage are consistent with items available at Walmart. McDonough asked directly whether the area surrounding Annie's workshop represents a concentrated zone for locating the individuals seen on that footage. He reached out to the Tucson Police Department during his time in the city. He asked specifically whether the Pima County Sheriff's Department had been working with their street intelligence teams, known as Bravo teams, to systematically gather information from community informants. The answer he received was no. After more than 144 days, coordinated street-level intelligence gathering between the Sheriff's Department and Tucson Police had not been systematically implemented. The informant networks, the people embedded in the community who hear things, who have things to trade, who know which conversations happened and where, had not been worked in any organized or coordinated way. And in McDonough's assessment, that gap is precisely where this case will ultimately find its answer. Not by waiting on DNA results sitting in a federal laboratory, not by waiting on blockchain analysis of a Bitcoin wallet address, Not by processing the 144th day of surveillance footage frame by frame without producing a name, but by going into the community, sitting across from people who know something and giving them a reason to say it out loud. Because people talk. The person who planned this told someone. The person who executed it told someone. A partner heard something they cannot stop thinking about. A family member noticed something they cannot explain. And eventually, the weight of carrying that knowledge becomes heavier than whatever is keeping them quiet. This is day 144. And here is what this week's convergence of developments actually confirms. The 2 ransom notes sent to the Guthrie family are now on the official investigative record as likely authentic, originating from the actual abductors. The first note proved insider knowledge of details no outsider could possess. The second note said Nancy perished shortly after she was taken, that she was buried with nature, that they never intended to hurt her, and that they were truly sorry. Both notes came from the same sender, using the same technical infrastructure. Derek Kella is changing his federal plea on July 2nd. The CBS confirmation dropped in the same week. The second note's contents became public in the same week, and Savannah Guthrie sat on national television and said her family is in agony and cannot be at peace. Whether that convergence is coincidence, or whether it represents a single thread being pulled carefully inside a case built on layers, the investigation is moving. Something has changed. And the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie, a woman who attended Mass every Sunday morning, who was first reported missing because she did not appear for a church live stream with the friends who loved her, who raised her children and tended her garden and walked through her front door on the night of January 31st and never came back. That answer exists somewhere. In a laboratory at Quantico. In a blockchain transaction record. In the memory of someone who has not yet decided to speak. Or in the stack of 50,000 tips still being processed by investigators who have not stopped working this case. The reward stands at $1,200,000, unclaimed. The Pima County Sheriff's Department can be reached at 520-351-4900, and anyone with information can contact the FBI anonymously at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Her daughter said it plainly. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. If you have stayed with this case from the beginning, or if this is the first time you are hearing these details laid out in full, there is more coming. Subscribe to DAV Crime Records and turn on notifications, because when the next development breaks in this investigation, and based on everything happening this week it will, this channel will be the place that puts it together completely, accurately, and without cutting corners. Like this video if it gave you something the headlines did not. Nancy Guthrie's family is still waiting, and this case is far from over.